So this is Trump. And people are saying, oh my God, I can't believe Trump is going to do the Insurrection Act to put down protests. Isn't he just like Hitler? Well, I don't know. Isn't he just like George Washington? Isn't he just like Thomas Jefferson? Isn't he just like James Madison? Isn't he just like all these other people? John Adams, who is, one of the most repressive people, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Because when you look at the Nazis' like positive allusions to the United States, the genocide of Native Americans is one of the things they hold up the most.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. As Trump surges ahead and liberals fail to stop him, we have to ask, what exactly are we up against? Is it just another authoritarian turn, or something much deeper rooted in American empire itself? Some say, let it burn, that US collapse could be good for the world. But a fascist America wouldn't mean the end of empire. It would mean its most violent, technologically advanced form yet. So how do we understand the threat? And what does a principled opposition look like in this moment? To help break it all down, I'm joined by our very own Eugene Puryear. But before we jump into it, this is just part of the conversation. To access the full interview and support independent journalism that challenges mainstream narratives, become a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode. Eugene Puryear, welcome back to Dispatches.
Well, Ronnie, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Well, it's great to be doing this episode because there's so much to talk about. And I want to remind everybody, this is Dispatches, not the Freedom Side Live. I don't want anybody to get confused here. But no, on a more serious note, we've got a lot of serious topics to get through on this episode. Everything from Trump to fascism, to how to understand it, to the crisis of capitalism, crisis of imperialism, and how we address it and fight back, and really looking towards history to understand what that fight might look like. But let's start at the beginning, Eugene. Let's start with the sort of like big picture, right? Because people have been throwing around this word fascism for a while now. I mean, we started hearing it a lot in 2016 when Trump first got elected. And there was a big debate over whether Trump is fascist or not, whether this or that policy is fascist or not. But I think it's important to understand what we're really dealing with here because, you hear this framing of Trump is just this, another right-wing authoritarian, or Trump is something deeper. So I guess my question is, let's understand these terms that we're talking about when we use them. How do you, Eugene, define fascism? How would you define it in this moment, I guess? And how does Trumpism reflect it or maybe go beyond it in the current context that we're in?
Yeah, well, it's an important conversation because I think that fascism, like a lot of things, is a term that can have a lot of meanings and is used by many people in many different ways. And I think that, when we talk about the American context, the rush of many people to brand Trump as fascist, which is particularly prominent, in I think liberal political discourse, right, has its own political uses that I think can be problematic, that also then sort of hide the danger of the incubating fascist movement that Trump is bringing forward by sort of having this alarmist scenario, like everyone should be concerned, but it's really designed as a political weapon to get people to vote in support for the Democrats. So it's a very politically charged conversation because a lot of it is not necessarily about sort of like fascism per se, but about what opposition to Trump should look like and who should lead it. And I think that's an important element to think of to start. But I think when we think about fascism and democracy, and again, democracy also sort of a loaded term, right? Like what we think of as democracy is not even exactly the same thing as what's written down in the Constitution, right? But I like to look at democracy and fascism as existing on a continuum. And I think that's also a great way to understand Trump. And when I say a continuum, maybe I could also have used, a Venn diagram as a way to think about it, because there's a whole range of things that when we see them happen, whether in the United States and Europe or anywhere around the world, people will say, well, that seems fascist. That's fascistic. That's like Nazi Germany, right? So there's a certain, I think, popular imagination and identification that exists with the word fascism that's like directly associated with Hitler and Nazi Germany. And people sort of make these these sort of logical leaps, like some police state scenario, burning of books, whatever it may be. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but when I say Venn diagram, continuum, what I mean there is when we look at a lot of those practices that we sort of mentally associate with like Hitlerian fascism and Nazi Germany and Mussolini and all these sort of popular representations, many of these things are also present in other countries and governments that we don't code as fascist, including the United States of America, right? So, we have this issue where there are certain policies, practices, cultural ways of operating that are very reminiscent of Hitler, very reminiscent of the Nazis, very reminiscent of Mussolini, but they're also reminiscent of the Jim Crow South. They're also reminiscent of the genocide of Native Americans. They're also reminiscent of the 10 million people who were killed by the Belgians in the Congo, by the Germans and the Namo and Herrera genocides. Like, the long history of great crimes and genocides, and even in the context of a democratic country like America, Jim Crow, you have all these different things that sort of exist in that middle part of the Venn diagram that, like, if you're talking about a fascist country like Hitler, they're there. But when you're talking about some of these countries that aren't considered fascist, they're not there. So that's what I mean when I say that Trump is really on this continuum. I think he's incubating a fascist movement without a doubt. I mean, you could just look at the people who are around him. I mean, people like Peter Thiel, who's very close to many of those around Trump, although it's worth noting he was not a big supporter of Trump in 2024. And that seems to be a part of his evolution. He said democracy is, I think, outdated or spent force or whatever the exact phrase was. And I think that he was unhappy with what happened in the first Trump term, that it didn't, meet his fascistic dreams to a degree he wanted. So he himself has pulled back a little bit from politics in that sense. But nonetheless, there are many similar people around him. You've got this guy, Curtis Yarvin, that everyone's talking about now, who's like kind of in the background, who's sort of a fascistic force himself, so-called dark enlightenment. You've got the network state crowd, which is very close to people like Mark Andreessen and others in the Silicon Valley world that is, preparing for some sort of breakdown of civilization and rise of, small feudal entities that will be run in a highly authoritarian manner. So you have all these people, and I could go on and on, honestly. I mean, you've got the extreme, militarist and police state type people. There's all these sort of fascistic elements that are within the Trump movement. I don't even think they're all necessarily 100% in alignment with each other, but they are also coterminous with people who I don't think have strictly fascist goals in the sense of, and I'm going to come to exactly what fascism is in a second here, but, certainly exist in the middle part of that Venn diagram. And since it's a Venn diagram, they can work together, right? But fascism in and of itself is the idea of the total abrogation of all democratic space and the destruction of existing institutions and the construction of new institutions that reflect this constriction of democratic space. So you can be very much in the middle part of that Venn diagram and extremely repressive, but still not want to necessarily be all the way over into the only fascist side where you don't just have overlap, but you just have a total abrogation of all elements of democratic space. So, you think about a Venn diagram. I'm just trying to visualize it for people here because I feel like it's complex when we talk about these things. You got like the only democracy, only fascism, then you got the middle part, right? Like any Venn diagram. So fascism is when you get rid of everything there on the left and you just have what's on the right and what's in the middle. And I think there are some people who still want some of what's in the left there, some of what we consider liberal democracy that are in the Trump coalition. And Trump himself, everything that he is doing that we consider to be bad is either legal for sure, or at least there is a battle of interpretation around whether or not it is legal, like whether or not the U.S. structures support these various different things or various laws comport with the Constitution. And so, again, you can see that he's pushing things very far in terms of the repressive apparatus and changing other aspects of the government, but still actually doing it within the framework of, actual U.S. democracy as it's written down and built up over the years. So I think there's an important facet to all of this and understanding that Trump is certainly, I think, pushing the forces that are pushing for a totally fascist reality forward. But I think he himself is still within a framework that is understandable, intelligible, and not unprecedented inside of U.S. democracy. And that has many of its own implications to it. So I don't know if that really answers your question about what fascism is, what democracy is. I don't know if it's a hard one to answer, but that's kind of how I look at this question when we're trying to sort of place Trump in how do we actually classify him?
Yeah, and I think also there's this assumption sometimes by liberals, though I think it's been shaken out of them a little bit over the last couple of months, because Trump has done so many things people didn't think would be possible, and we'll talk about some of what I mean there later on this episode. But I'm curious if you could speak to this tendency to just assume that, oh, he'll sabotage himself, he's just incompetent, he's a clown. Our institutions will hold. But you could argue people said that about, other fascists in history. So I don't want to be alarmist, but I also think it's important to be realistic. So could you speak a bit to why that logic is dangerous, that logic of Trump will fail because he's just an incompetent clown, rather than the fact that, there is a segment of the ruling class that is supporting him?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I would just say is sort of, what is the relationship of competence to potential damage done? Like, you could be incompetent and still the results could be terrible. And in fact, lack of competence, is often the cause of, significant disasters. Like, if you are not a competent administrator of a dam, the dam can burst and there can be great floods and deaths, right? So, in some ways, I think sometimes people, hoping he'll shoot himself in the foot, whatever, he's incompetent, it won't work out. Like, even if it doesn't really work out, it can still be extremely dangerous. And even in the context of people bumbling and stumbling around, it can still have significant harm for average, everyday, working class Americans and people from oppressed communities here. So in some senses, I would just say that it's almost like an irrelevant point whether he's competent or incompetent, because the goals of what he's trying to do are so pernicious that just trying to carry them out in any way is a great danger. But I also think, it's not even clear to me that he is incompetent. I mean, you can certainly say that some of the things Trump is doing are not working out. I mean, certainly the way that he dealt with the trade war, for instance, I mean, he was way out on a limb and there was sort of a mini rebellion of Wall Street. And so since Trump, like every other president, listens to his corporate masters, he rode back his policies to reflect the fact that his initial strategy was not successful, that it was blunted, that it was defeated, that he had to surrender and retreat in major ways, including to China, right? So like, obviously he didn't succeed. But you can look at other things he's doing. And I would say in terms of, slashing and cutting the government, they're actually acting in a highly competent fashion. They're doing a very good job. I mean, they have it set up now to deliver a massive tax break to the richest Americans, which they were promising the whole way. So from that point of view, highly competent. So when it comes to large parts of their agenda, as far as I can see, they're expressing extreme competence. And it's interesting that the greatest competence expressed by the Trump administration seems to be in destroying anything good in the government that actually helps average people and delivering huge basically corporate welfare to the richest individuals and corporations. Like, that's the area where they're the most focused and the most successful. Says a lot about their agenda. But I think on many other fronts, I mean, it's the immigration, mixed bag. I don't think they've deported as many people as they like, but obviously they've thrown a massive, net of fear over the entire country. They're pursuing a range of sophisticated, novel legal theories to remove people from the country. They're developing, everything they can from an apparatus perspective to build that out. So that seems pretty competent and efficient. So, I mean, I think that a lot of times people, they look at Trump as having kind of a buffoonish reality to him. Which I think, to allude to your earlier point, people used to often say similar things about Mussolini, but who also kind of had a very similar kind of showman type thing that often to some people seemed a little less than serious. But I don't know if that kind of entertainment value from Trump, which is I think what people view as competence, is a sign of incompetence. I think it's a sign of showmanship and entertainment value to sort of cover up the reality of what he's doing, so it doesn't seem as bad as it is, by covering it with a certain sense of spectacle that is sort of ethereal. So it feels sort of like, it doesn't seem as serious and as bad and pernicious because it's kind of, funny and light and entertaining. I mean, this is an element of his persona. But I also think even some of the other things, like people like you look at the Doge people who obviously are lying about a lot of what they're doing and what they're delivering. And people say, oh, they're incompetent. They don't know what they're doing. Are they incompetent and they don't know what they're doing? Or are they deliberately misrepresenting what they're doing because they're doing exactly what they're there to do? Like they're not there to actually create government efficiency. They're there to slash and burn the government. So, that's what they're carrying out. So I think some of it is just how we look at it. And I think how Trump's popular presentation kind of plays into this. And I think that in and of itself is a danger, because if you don't take him that seriously, or you assume it's not that bad, then it's easy to sort of look at, the whole show of it, and the full impact of what they're doing doesn't become clear.
Yeah, I mean that's important on a number of levels. And then I want to speak to another issue, because I often say this to you, and on our weekly live stream Thursdays 3 p.m. Eastern, Freedom Side Live, be there. I'm just gonna have random ways to like subliminally throw that into this episode. But is that we always talk about America being, well, we don't, but the general mainstream talks about America being the oldest democracy. It was founded on such amazing principles. But, you could argue that America was the first fascist dictatorship. I mean, like, what else do you call a system of literal human slavery, forcing people to labor against their will in bondage? And if they run away, you chase them down because they're considered the literal property of the ruling class. Like, I'm not really sure what's more blatantly fascist than that. And then you brought up Native American genocide earlier. But all that's to say, if some people are arguing America is this first fascist dictatorship, then could you say that some of what we're seeing today is less a break from that, utopian past everybody likes to talk about, and more like a return to form? Because in many ways, and I think I've heard you say this before, Eugene, fascism is the DNA of this country, not some foreign import. So I guess, how do we understand the roots of this through settler colonialism, through racialized capitalism, and through American empire?
Yeah, well, this is an important question, and it again goes back to this idea of a continuum, and it also goes back to the idea of the point you just made. Like, what are the real roots of Trump? Like, we don't need to look to Hitler; we can look here. I mean, I'll give people a good example. The Insurrection Act, like Trump has been talking a lot about, he wants to use the Insurrection Act to be able to put down, uprisings. You remember his first term, he said that, right? During the 2020 George Floyd uprising, that he wanted to do this. He wasn't able to carry it out, but he said he wanted to do it, right? The 1807, the Insurrection Act. Well, the Insurrection Act is essentially a continuation of the militia acts that had been started since the 1790s. And it was an attempt to basically provide a legal framework for the president to be able to intervene with federal force against Native Americans and popular uprisings, because the militia acts came at a time that, well, they came directly in the wake of something called the Battle of Wabash, which is the biggest loss ever for the U.S. military in the 1790s. Out of 1,000 U.S. troops, all but 24 were killed. So it was a major victory for Native Americans resisting the seizure and encroachment upon their lands. So that very quickly created a chain reaction of like, well, we need a much better military if we're going to crush these people, steal their land, and genocide them. So we're going to have to bring together a better framework of these various militias of the different states, put them under the head of the federal government. And the other thing that was happening at this time, you had things like Shays Rebellion, you had the Whiskey Rebellion. You had a long history, actually, in addition to those particular things I just mentioned, of, say, the regulators movement in North Carolina, or similar movements in New York, where you had small farmers like burning down courthouses over, their rights to land against major, landowners and landholding. Slave uprisings, of course, which is something that was constantly discussed by the elites at that time, and at other times, servile war, as they used to often call it, an allusion to the Roman Spartacus, Third Servile War, I believe that was. But, anyway, you can see that also looming large over their minds of things that had happened. Even the revolution itself, right? Like, the founding fathers did not want universal suffrage, but you look at some of the first, early meetings happening in Worcester, Mass, which was one of the centers of where, small farmers and artisans were gathering to resist the British. They said they wanted universal suffrage. You look on the streets of Boston, the streets of Philadelphia, you had, movements that, of course, they're associated now. We associate them, Sam Adams and, all these other people, but we don't hear about the fact that many of these people were very fearful of the movements they themselves set in train, because they were popular movements that wanted the rich and powerful to be checked. by them, which the rich and powerful did not want, right? So I say all that just to say the Insurrection Act is 100% embedded. This is 1807, so very early in the country, based on the Militia Acts of the 1790s, very early in the country. So it's seminal because it speaks to the nature of U.S. democracy that from its very inception was designed to have a very strong repressive edge to it to prevent Native Americans from protecting their land, their people, and their way of life, and to be able to use the full power of the state from the top down to crush potential popular rebellions against the elite rule of the rich, which was explicitly the type of society the founding fathers set forward. So this is Trump. And people are saying, oh my God, I can't believe Trump is going to do the Insurrection Act to put down protest. Isn't he just like Hitler? Well, I don't know. Isn't he just like George Washington? Isn't he just like Thomas Jefferson? Isn't he just like James Madison? Isn't he just like all these other people? John Adams, who is, one of the most repressive people. The Alien and Sedition Acts was passed by John Adams, right? And that's a lot of what Trump is using to remove people from the country, right? This is a big element. And what was that actually about? Well, the Alien and the Sedition Acts was about the fear of the French Revolution infecting the United States, because obviously France and the United States had a lot of relationship between each other in this revolutionary period all across the Atlantic basin, the US, the French, the Haitian Revolution that's happening. And the French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, very, very radical, and certainly much more leveling in the sense of the attacks on the aristocracy. And the aristocracy in America, even though they weren't a hereditary aristocracy, was very afraid of that and very afraid of what that could mean. And you even could see some of the things and people who were caught up, like the Aurora newspaper, which is a Jeffersonian newspaper, the Democratic Republicans, they called them, the opposition to John Adams. But one of the things that really riled people up about what this newspaper in Philadelphia was doing is it was allegedly pushing forward this budding conspiracy of radical Irishmen and free Negroes, quote unquote, that was allegedly growing in Philadelphia and potentially, challenging the rich and powerful, in addition to this issue of the French Revolution. And I'll note for you to further tie this in, Gabriel's rebellion in Virginia, both of our home states, one of the great slave rebellions of all time. Now, sadly, where you're from in Northern Virginia, they were a little outside the territory. But in my home county of Albemarle County, of course, they were recruiting soldiers to fight in this rebellion. But what's important to this is there were white French people who were working with Gabriel to mobilize the poor whites. And a big part of Gabriel's thought process was if they were going to be able to seize the governor's mansion in Richmond, that many of the poor whites that worked along the waterfront and were small farmers and things like that would actually rally to their cause, because he was promoting, a real democracy, not a democracy of the rich planters, slave owners, and merchants and bankers that was established in Virginia at the time. So, you can just see, in so many different ways how this time, this 1790s, early 1800s, that have birthed things like the Insurrection Act, that birth things like the Alien and Sedition Act, that are the actual things that Trump is using to do many of the things we think are bad, are not only distinctly American, but 100% rooted in the issue of the genocide of Native Americans, the suppression of popular rebellion, in particular slave rebellions, and the desire to maintain a certain amount of elite rule. Now, we could go on and on. I mean, we could talk about the thousands of Black people murdered during Reconstruction. We could talk about Jim Crow, which was essentially the imposition of a fascist dictatorship on a section of the country to accompany certain economic goals. But I want to come back around to the overall point here of how we relate America to Hitler in this sense, and why I wanted to talk about the Insurrection Act, the Battle of Wabash, the institution of suppressing Native Americans. Because when you look at the Nazis' positive allusions to the United States, the genocide of Native Americans is one of the things they hold up the most. In fact, the entire sort of German justification around this idea of Lebensraum and moving to the East, they were justifying by saying, well, look, the U.S., when they went to the West, that's how they got strong. They murdered all these Native Americans. I mean, as early as 1928, Hitler was saying, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, he praised the United States for shooting down millions of, well, he used a slur against Native Americans, the same one that used to be the Washington football team name, that was shooting down millions of them. He praised them for shooting down millions of them and keeping those who are left in cages, i.e. the reservations. So it's a pretty, harrowing thing when you look it all up. There's a book called Hitler's American Model, I believe is the name of it, that lays a lot of this out. But they were openly saying, because they wanted to create, remember, an American-style capitalist superstate in Europe from the Channel to the Urals. And so they're looking at the United States and saying to create that kind of dominant economic power in the middle of the 20th century, the way to get there is the way the US got there. And that's to use genocide and slavery to clear the land and provide the initial labor to build up the initial capital to, in the Nazi mind, be able to challenge American economic supremacy, right? So there's a direct relationship there that the Nazis themselves were often drawing on. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have here when we say, is Trump a fascist? Is like, yes, I think he's incubating fascism, but I think he's also continuing the threads of, again, this continuum, this Venn diagram of the sort of uniquely authoritarian and repressive American state that is designed to be expansive. So it's not always repressive. And that's the different element from fascism, right? And from Nazi Germany, which was, total lack of all democratic space. America is manipulating democratic space, democratic rights, popular rights, and all these other things in order to be able to establish capitalist rule. But it is abrogating to itself great repressive rights as well that, not only look like fascism, but were borrowed from by the actual fascists. So again, the continuum, the Venn diagram, we have to be careful with it because, there's this history. There's the history of Nazi Germany, and now that history of what happened in Nazi Germany is also imprinted in America and has had its own impact. So anyway, I'll stop there before I ramble, but that's maybe my thought about that.
No,
question.
it's so important to remember that. I think it's important to remind people because it's always like, oh no, Hitler, oh no, Mussolini, and it's like, what about oh no, America?
Yeah, definitely.
I want to talk about the fact that this isn't just about Trump, which I think is going to be an ongoing theme here, but it's about a changing global order, in many ways a collapsing global order. We're seeing so many trends taking place that are alarming, one of which you've mentioned many times, and I've seen you talk about this on the Socialist program, the fact that a lot of these great powers of these in the global north, like across Europe, are rearming. You have Japan rearming. You've got these Gulf states using indentured servitude and also arming and using AI to build these these kind of surveillance dystopias that people like Trump and others in power are just getting wide-eyed over. So there's a lot happening here. And I think it's related to a kind of crisis of capitalism, right? And when it comes down to it, I guess I want you to explain to our audience, how does a crisis of capitalism, like what we're seeing, produce this sort of authoritarian response? And I want to again say, this is not just happening in the US. It really is a trend all around the world.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, Frederick Douglass said power concedes nothing without a demand, which I think is a great point. And the whole speech is fantastic. And I think people should look it up. But there are sometimes that power does not concede, right? Like, because their core prerogatives are at stake. I mean, you look at the issue of the Confederacy in the United States in the context of the Civil War. I think the most notable thing is that, Lincoln was not proposing to end slavery. He was just saying that slavery couldn't really expand that much further than where it was already at. And that means that, you'd have hundreds of years left of slavery, undoubtedly, right? Like, it wasn't like slavery was going to go extinct. But for the slave owners, slavery was correct. So why should they not be able to expand everywhere else in the globe? Why should they not be able to continue their way of life? Like, why should they stop? So their core prerogative, which was, to maintain the value of the slave system, was overriding of logic in a way. And so they launched this, I think kind of easily predictable failed insurrection that was failed and crushed, right? But sometimes power doesn't concede. So I think the thing about the crisis of capitalism and how does it, really impact repressive apparatuses is that there are some things that capital is going to concede on and some things that it is not going to concede on. And it will certainly concede to various different reforms at certain times. At other times, it won't concede to even the exact same reforms. They may try to roll them back, or, something similar could be brought up and they could say, well, in this context, that's not relevant, right? So there is, that kind of back and forth. But when you get to a point where you don't want to concede, there's only one way to act, and that is to act with force in order to prevent those who are trying to force you to concede from exercising their own power over you in some way, shape, or form. So capitalism overall as a system, always has a repressive edge. I mean, Lenin says the core of the state is the cops, the military, and the prisons, right? And I think there's a certain truth to that, because why does anyone do what they do in capitalist society? Because it's the law. And people don't want to break the law because they don't want to be arrested. They don't want to be arrested because they don't want to go to jail. And so you can see how behind all the sort of flowery language of, this, that, and the third, the rule of law is essentially the rule of weapons. And the force that has the element that has the preponderance of force can force other people to follow the rules that they make. So the billionaires, the capitalists, the millionaires, the 1%, the ruling elite, I think, if we ask any person on the street, is that who controls politics? They'll say yes. I think if we went back 100 years, people would say, yes, that's true in even bigger sense. So they make the rules, they make the laws. And when they decide things, they don't want to concede, they don't concede. I mean, which is another point, by the way, around the issue of Trump being rooted in America. I mean, you talk about the use of open violence and the use of the state against people. I mean, just look at, he's always talking about the 1890s, which I actually love that Trump is always talking about the 1890s, because this was the era of robber baron rule and when the Jim Crow dictatorship was solidified in the South, right? So this is, of course, we know about Jim Crow, but people don't know as much about how, the open, you talk about the Insurrection Act, when all the governors in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s would be trying to get the government to intervene to break the strikes, they would be calling on them saying there's an insurrection and we need the federal government to come put them down. That's exactly what they were saying in the Great Strike of 1877, right? The opening of fire into large crowds. And that, I mean, this is the first general strike in America in 1877. But you think, the Molly Maguires, which, people who know the labor movement know about the Molly Maguires. People should look this up. It was a complete fake plot created by the mine owners and the railway companies to break organizing by Irish mine workers in Pennsylvania. And it was the private corporation that creates this totally fake plot that then brings evidence into the courtroom. The head of one of the main corporations involved in this gets made the special counsel and uses the corporation counsel of the corporations to try and convict these people and then hang them. So basically the government just gave over the courts to railway and mine companies and allowed them to create a fake conspiracy and hang 10 people.
That's so crazy.
Right. And that's, totally legal. That's America. Right. So but this is the context of what's happening, is that in these moments where there's depressions or recessions, it often you can see the repressive edge can come out a little bit because capital is protecting itself. But at various other times, whether the economy is going up or going down, McCarthyism in the 50s, the economy was going up, and it was to protect the capitalist ascendancy that they wanted to eliminate, any real challenges to capitalist ascendancy. So there's a direct relationship between the two. I mean, and I think you maybe want to talk about this later, but I think this, speaks to the issue of what we see with the expansion of ICE and cop cities and all these other things, that this is just a necessary aspect of capitalism. And this is, again, we talk about that continuum, kind of the difference between democracy and fascism. Again, and I've kind of alluded to this, but I want to just repeat this as much as possible because I think they're complex, contested concepts, is, sort of democracy as we know it under capitalism is, again, as I've said before, designed to be both repressive and expansive, and to have the opportunity for sort of carrots and sticks, where fascism is kind of like just sticks. And there are certain people who are given favored positions in a fascist hierarchy, but there is no sort of democratic contestation in any way, shape, or form, right? So again, I think it's important we keep that continuum, that Venn diagram in our mindset when we think about this and look at this. But I do think it speaks very heavily to the general point you're making, that, again, continuum, Venn diagram, is that this hard, authoritarian, repressive edge is a feature, not a bug, of even like regular democratic capitalist systems. And it can come into play at various moments when capital doesn't want to concede its core demands. But at certain points, it decides that its core demands, its core prerogatives are so great that all democracy is too dangerous. So when the Nazis decide to build, an American-style superstate in Europe, and what was in the Soviet Union, just like America, they brought in a hard repressive edge. But different than the United States, which in that hard repressive edge still had sort of democratic contestation amongst a certain category of white people, that was an expanding category of white people over time. It was like in Germany, everyone was in this rigid, no democratic space. So similarities, but differences. And I think that's important. But again, it's a feature, not a bug. And it's like you're kind of moving to fascism is kind of passing over a continuum, even though it does reach a hard break, rather than something that's like totally different and totally outside of the experience of capitalist state building.
Well, so just to go off of what you're saying in terms of the US specifically, you do have these kinds of like limited rights that operate in that sort of complex context of democracy and democratic contestation that you're talking about. And those rights have expanded over time and then sometimes been taken away. But, you know, I guess, how do we make sense of the limited rights that do exist? And because they didn't always exist, right? People had to win them. And what happens to those rights in a moment like this? Because those are the rights that they're coming after right now. And some people might say, oh, we never really had true free speech. But in a way, there is a kind of, you know, there is a free speech that we do have in the US that is very much under attack right now in an unprecedented way. So it's important to like understand those nuances. And I think not just have these sort of, I'm not saying you do, I don't, you know, some people have these kind of black and white sort of like, well, we never really had that right anyways. And it's like, well, it existed to a degree because people did fight for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. I think this is true about the United States. It's also true about Europe as well, is that, you know, the vast majority of like democratic rights that like we feel everyone has are, as you said, like one, oftentimes with a lot of blood being shed in the context of it. Like you can think about the US Civil War being a good example of that, right? But we can think about, you know, the suffragette movement. We can think about the right to eliminate property qualifications, right? I mean, even from the very beginning, really, like kind of the first expansion of the franchise was partially, and I say partially, I would say to a large degree, there may be some historians who disagree with me on this, related to the fact that, you know, the people who had fought in the revolution, many of them, you know, were not rich people. And to exclude them from the franchise would not really work out. And you see after the Revolutionary War, you know, quote unquote 1776, you can see after the War of 1812, like the basic rights are expanded on the basis of the fact that people shed their blood for these abstract words, and you have to expand it. But also, of course, the social struggles, the rights of the labor movement, you know, which honestly, like a lot of things people don't think about in terms of, you know, free speech. A lot of the things around what you can say are around the restrictions that were put on communists in the 50s and the legal struggles that they waged in order to be able to advocate, you know, for communism and to form communist parties. And, you know, it's just, there's very few like popular rights that don't relate from popular struggle. And when you look at what the founders were trying to do, like, I mean, you know, it's in a way I feel Trump and these other people have kind of given us a gift when they say, yeah, we should go back and read what the founders were saying. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. We should 100% go back and read what they were saying, because they were not shy about what they were doing. And I don't want to get off on a whole historical tangent, but, you know, from the point of view of how people had lived up until that time from a perspective of like the governments they had, even the like highly limited elite democracy of America and many of the emerging ones in Europe was, you know, pretty democratic in a relative sense, right? And, you know, ultimately overcoming the divine right of kings. Because like this is what this was really all about. Like, why did all these people, this bourgeoisie, all rise up at this time, right? It wasn't because commerce was not booming prior to that, but it was because the sort of absolutist feudal structure of things had outgrown capitalism. So you had a situation where you could build up a big money empire and the king could then just come in one day and say, you know what, Rania, I gave you all those contracts. I gave you all that land. You're making a lot of money, but my cousin is very upset with you right now. So I'm taking all your money and all your land and I'm giving it to my cousin, and there's nothing you can do about it. You know what I mean? And what are you going to do? You can't challenge me because nobody voted me in. God put me here. So I'm over top of all of y'all. You know what I mean? I'm over top of everybody. Only God can touch me. Like this is, you know, we don't think about it like that in the way we describe it, but that's like the mentality of these monarchs, right? But if for a capitalist, you think like, well, wait a second, like this is not right. Like I can't bring up all my stuff and then somebody with I have no say, no control, no ability, no recourse to challenge them can just take my stuff like that. So ultimately, they knew they had to enshrine the right of property. But to enshrine the right of property, they had to enshrine the right of individuals, right? The people, the right that you have the right to own certain things, and that outside of the system, that everyone is sort of equal within the system, and no one can take what you have outside of the rules that we collectively set up, right? So that it inscribes private property. But by inscribing the rights of the individual, then you get all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, which opens up, like a broader piece, which, as I was saying earlier in the show, they were like 100% aware of that, because the process of going against the British king, against King George, was drawing up a lot of these popular struggles. And the contradiction between the 13 colonies and the king was also opening up the struggle for slaves in a big way. So they saw the danger in what they were doing, and they deliberately set it up in a way that it was designed to be, sort of an elite rule type system, right? Like that is the point of what they were trying to do. Now, I'm actually kind of losing the thread of your question, because I've gone off on this whole thing.
No, he's not a history professor, but it's fascinating. But no, I think that gives a couple actually really important examples of how rights were won, because they were won. And it can be, and let's like.
Yes, sorry, that's the point. Yes, rights were won. That's what I wanted to say just to close, because you're right. I had lost it, but that's where I'm coming. So they set it up in this way, but they set it up in a way that they knew that they would have to make some compromises, right? Like, Madison's famous Federalist Paper 10 about factions, he says the most durable faction is between rich and poor, and that's never going to change. And of course, he's saying the role of the US government is to, balance the factional interests that exist, right? So they were themselves sort of putting together a framework that opened itself up for people who they didn't want to have rights to be able to seize on those contradictions and to establish those rights, and to establish a popular conception that the meaning of these words was not the meaning that the founders said or thought in their heads, but the meaning of what they wrote on paper, which is much more expansive and much more broadly. So it's always been contested. So people say, okay, we don't have these rights. Well, it goes up and it goes down. At one point, the government had Japanese Americans in internment camps. Then it later said, well, that was illegal, so you can't do that anymore. Now, maybe they're going to try to bring that back. So it's always been a contested factor, but the very nature of how the system was constructed to be able to balance interest in a way that allowed the ruling class to stay on top the best possible way, the carrot and the stick, allowed a lot of democratic space to sort of to grab hold of that and to turn it into something bigger than it was ever meant to be. And I think that has been powerful. It's that those rights to free speech, the right to strike, the right to organize a union, the right for people to vote, the right for all these other things that have made many of the actual positive things that have happened in this country possible. And I don't think we should give that away in a sense that's like cavalier, because people fought and died for it, because it's not minor, it's actually relevant. And the whole reason they want to take a lot of these rights away is because it does constrain the ability of capital to rule over us all in untrammeled ways. So we have to understand the construction of the issue historically in creating an authoritarian element, but also creating a potential hope and democratic aspiration beyond what it ever was conceived of, that has opened up a whole new struggle for defining democracy. And I think that's how, when we talk about going forward from this moment, we have to break from a system that shackles the definition of democracy to the sort of US constitutional framework, which is the logical conclusion, I think, of the popular democratic struggles that have already made gains within that framework.
And speaking of having those rights taken away, I think what we're seeing now is state power used in ways that perhaps our generation, at least, has not experienced before. And that is what we're seeing with the political repression, specifically with Trump's use of ICE to carry out that political repression and to really test the waters for who he can go after. The real, just general weaponization of state power. And I think what's interesting about that is it's escalated most recently in quite a significant way. First, of course, it's like going after people who have student visas. He's going after people with green cards. He's threatening to eventually go after naturalized citizens, and doing it, through the issue of Palestine, but not just the issue of Palestine. And then now we see him using ICE to openly threaten Democratic politicians. You had the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, literally arrested by ICE. The threat of ICE arresting several members of Congress who are Democrats. So this is new, and it's not because I love Democrats and I'm just like, I want to sit here and defend the Democratic Party. It's that this is a dangerous new development when you have one ruling party using a state policing, or I'm sorry, a federal policing apparatus as a political tool against their ideological opponents. So, on top of that, I want to go back to, again, Trump has floated mass deportations. He's floated using the military internally. And I guess all that's to say, what does it mean when institutions like ICE, which are already violent, already unaccountable, we've covered it a lot on our programs here at Breakthrough News, what does it mean when they're politicized even further to carry out that sort of edge, that violent edge that you were talking about?
Well, I think it means that we're reaching a moment where, as we've been talking about in the issue of this violent edge, where I think that there is just a greater perception amongst elements of the ruling class, ruling elite, 1%, bourgeoisie, whatever we want to call them, there's a lot of different names, that there are severe limits to what they are going to allow to take place in terms of reforms. And there's differences of opinion, between the two major parties about how far they should go in that regard. And Trump is obviously going in an extreme direction. They're arresting mayors, they're arresting judges. I mean, you look at what's happening with, the deportations. I think there's, a sort of more insidious aspect to this in terms of how it's framed and in terms of the connection to sort of quote unquote citizens and non-citizens. And that is, they're equating speech with action, right? Like just saying you're for the right of Palestinians to resist, which is, enshrined in international law, now is being taken essentially as, and the way it's being presented, the same as quote unquote terrorism, right? You know what I mean? And even that, there's a lot of loaded things and all of that. But I just say all that just to say that you can see they're trying to create sort of a thought crime regime where it's not really about what you do, it's about what you say. And that they're constructing a legal rationale around creating a number of official enemies on the basis of these thought crimes. And that they're further empowering these federal policing agencies and their state and local adjuncts to then sort of carry out the attempts to repress people on the basis of these thought crime categories. And you can hear it from what they say. They say we're going after the radical Marxists and criminals and all these other, you know what I'm saying? I mean, they're openly saying what they're doing. And I think, it's like COINTELPRO and McCarthyism rolled into one with a little dollop of vanilla ice cream from South Africa on top, which is like a whole other kind of side quest here. Like when we talk about the kind of sort of cultural reality and talk about Nazi Germany, and again, I'm not against talking about Nazi Germany. We talk about America, but also the fact that there's a lot of people tied to apartheid South Africa, which is its own strain of fascism, that are inside of the sort of mentality and culture of MAGA, like that. I don't want to even get off on that, but just to say that, you know what I'm saying? So ultimately, you've got this very heady brew. And just apartheid South Africa, McCarthyism, COINTELPRO, all those sort of things I'm using as precedents here, you can see that the end result is major repression of the left. And the end result is major repression of the left because, the quote unquote left, and we could go on a long historical discourse if you want about why we call it the left and the right, but I'm not going to do that now, is what actually offers a different liberatory vision that is beyond capitalism, that shows that there are ways to address the problems that are existing for humanity that are driving us all up the wall, that, here we are in 2025 and we can't solve hunger, poverty. We can't even have a high-speed train in the United States. You know what I mean? The fact that we can transcend all these problems and we can find a way as humanity to live together with peace, prosperity, and equitable distribution of resources, that's 100% possible. And we don't have to be trapped in this game of carrot and stick from capitalist governments. We don't have to be in a position where we're choosing between a limited democracy and an outright fascism. We can actually transcend bourgeois democracy and fascism and establish socialism and really live true, dignified lives. And that's dangerous. That's very dangerous to those who want to push fast. So for Trump, it's and this is, people should go back. Why is he constantly saying, I'm going after the Marxists and the communist radicals and all that? I'm a communist, I'm a Marxist. I'm a follower of Lenin, I'm for all of that. And I wish we were as powerful as Trump is saying. It's kind of crazy. I'm just like, this is out of control, but it's because you can see the seeds of it. And that is the nature of so much of of what's dangerous, I think, about the way Trump is developing the federal policing agencies and the use of the repressive force is similar to McCarthyism, especially, but also kind of combining McCarthyism and COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was like a real increase of the repressive apparatus, but it was all kind of underground. McCarthyism was like a very overground ideological piece. Now we have this like heavy strengthening of the repressive apparatus. And because of the post 9/11 laws that are basically bipartisan, a lot of what was done in COINTELPRO is actually legal now for the FBI and NSA and others to do. And then you have a similar McCarthyite atmosphere. You're creating a thought crime regime, and you're bringing those two things together. And the thought crimes are left-wing thought crimes and liberatory thought crimes and emancipatory thought crimes. And they're doing everything possible because Trump's trend in the ruling class, like I said, it's incubating fascism. They may not all be fascist, but they're the people who want to push the agenda and press the pedal the most to move into a dark place for humanity in the world. And they know that they have to neutralize opposition at the outset. And that's why I think you're seeing also like the thuggishness of it too, the theater of it. Yeah. The things with the people in shackles, they were saying we're doing our deportation ASMAR or whatever. The way they're all dressed up like they're, doing a SOCOM raid on the Taliban leadership when they're going to get some, middle-aged person who's going to offer no resistance. Like the whole thing is designed in a way to create an atmosphere around it and a culture around it. And I think that's a big part of fascism that is relevant to like Nazi Germany and to Mussolini is their ability to use theater to create political outcomes was significant. And their ability to orchestrate mass events and open thuggishness in a way that is very similar to how Trump and MAGA display it, I think goes a long way in terms of creating the cultural environment as well, that in addition to just the actual repression, like you and I being picked up off the street, creates a climate of fear that keeps people from acting.
So this is, of course, taking the state apparatus and using it against internal enemies, right? Which is kind of like that hallmark of fascism. But, there is this strain of thinking.
Say Russell Vought, I'm sorry to say this. I hate cutting you off, but you're sparking so many great thoughts for me, Rania. The Russell Vought, who is the head of OMB, who's the main person who Trump has dismantling the entire government, who's like a crazy... he does want to go back to the 1890s, before the Civil Rights Movement, before the New Deal, before the Progressive era. Like, go back to reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. That's the level of government regulation thinks we should have. But he said, very importantly, I'm not that worried about Russia, Iran, China. We can handle them. More important is the internal enemies. So, like, there are a lot of people in the Trump space that recognize what they want to pull off is so extreme. The most important element, and so extreme vis-a-vis what has happened since the New Deal. Now, prior to the New Deal, less extreme, but like, again, we won these things, we changed these things. These were things that people thought wouldn't be rolled around, that they're so extreme that they have to crush the internal resistance to it because it will be so great. So I think that's just an important thing also in our framework of Trump. So sorry, go ahead, please.
No, that's really alarming. But I wanted to say, there's this strain of thinking out there, especially among the kind of accelerationist types, that if the U.S. falls apart, it goes towards fascism or implodes into like fascist hellscape. Maybe that's good for the world, right? The empire is already murdering people globally, so like let it do it to themselves internally, let it burn. That's one mentality. I'm sure you've heard it before. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating it a bit, but just to give an idea. There are others who say that, the argument goes that American workers are too materially invested in imperialism to ever actually revolt. So why even try to organize in the US? Like, what's even the point if you're just never going to have a revolution there because of the fact that everybody on some level benefits from imperialism? They're doing better than their counterparts in the global South. That's another kind of like line of thinking and argument that I've heard. It's not that there aren't grains of truth to some of that, in the sense that like I do understand people outside, especially in the global South, having this view of the US like, you destroy my country all day, every day of the year. Like, why should I care if people in your country are suffering for once? I understand where that sentiment's coming from. And it is true, right, that Americans do benefit not every American, but American workers to some degree, they do benefit from a better living standard than their working class counterparts in the global South because of imperialism. That's not inaccurate. But I think both of these arguments miss something critical, which is that, a fascist US doesn't mean less imperialism and it doesn't mean less empire. It means a more violent, more unrestrained, more technologically advanced empire with literally like zero breaks. So, Eugene, what happens to the rest of the world if we were to have a fascist America take hold? You'd be talking about fascism or a fascist power structure in a country with the most powerful military in human history. And I'm not saying that to deny how violent the US already is around the world. I mean, you could argue it kind of does behave, fascistically in many countries. But yeah, if you could address some of those arguments I put forth, and sorry, maybe I'm putting opinions in your mouth that I shouldn't. So if you disagree with me, please feel free.
No. I mean, I think those are all important, points, and I think important points people are raising. I mean, one thing I think to think about this is the collapse of the Roman Empire. There's a reason why the era of collapse of the Roman Empire after it is called the Dark Ages. And it wasn't because it was good. So I think if we put it in that context, we're looking at a new Dark Ages on a global scale, not just a European scale. Because if you look at the nature of, the Peter Thiels of the world and, maybe even Trump himself to some degree and other people who are around him, the things that they want to drive forward, the policies they want to drive forward are, first and foremost going to destroy the planet and, the existence of humanity on Earth. We've been here for 100,000 some odd years. Like, I feel like that is a concern of all of us. And the possibility of that ending is like not fake. And to a large degree, the policies being pushed by the ultra-right, semi-fascist, fascist, far right of a special type, to use the phrase that Tricon has lifted up, whatever we want to call it, is going to drive that forward. So again, Dark Ages, the destruction of our ability to actually just like survive, drink water and air and grow food. On top of that, I think the point you're making about imperialism, I think is correct, right? Like, I mean, one, Trump is already saying he's going to take over Greenland and Panama, but like what is the element? Why is he saying that? And I mean, I talked about this on the Socialist program a couple months ago. To my point of view, it is to solidify the possibility of nuclear war with China, right? Or some sort of war with China. I mean, this is, of course, something that, many people, I mean, this is the, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy who thinks about war planning is Elbridge Colby, who this is his whole line of thinking. His whole book is that America needs to structure its military force and apparatus and foreign relations to prepare itself to win a war against China so that it can subdue China. Now, if he, of course, says, I don't want to go to war with them, but we have to make it so clear we'll destroy them if we do go to war, that they then just like listen to our dictates. And in the context of how wars happen, usually when you have that mentality, you end up in a war. So you just think about the context, obviously, of Greenland and where it is and the relationship to the Arctic, the relationship to Russia and the different sea lanes. You think Panama, the Panama Canal already has a lot of problems, you know what I mean? And you can already look at what's happening in Mexico now, where they've done the like interoceanic train is kind of, I think, going to take over Pacific to Atlantic trade over the Panama Canal. Nicaragua might make this canal with China. I don't know if that's going to happen. Seems like it has a lot of challenges, but I just say all that to say, but I think the whole point of Panama is not to control all trade, but to have like one Pacific to Atlantic situation that they definitely control in the case of war. Like Mexico is not reliable. Nicaragua, could be working directly with China. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's how they're thinking. So you can already see that a lot of it is preparation for the possibility of great power conflict that in this era leads to nuclear war. So just right off the top there, I think everyone on the globe has a stake in the struggle against the global far right, which is not just Trump. It's also people in Europe. It's also Modi in India. It's also Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's in the global South. Like it's the, right wing in South Africa, you know what I mean? Who is using Trump to push their agenda against the, legacies of the liberation movement and Black political majority rule. So you can see that, if we don't check these people, it's not like you cannot care about workers in America. I mean, I hope you do, but even if you don't, if we don't check this broader tendency, then this is going to be like a new global dark ages that, because of the nature of climate change and nuclear war, could be the end of humanity. And some people are going to say that's grandiose, but I don't think it is at all. I mean, that is why a huge number of people who created the atomic bomb regretted it and said we should never use it, and wanted to, heavily regulate or eliminate the use of nuclear weapons for that reason. You know what I'm saying? Like, from the very beginning, the possibility of this has been so high, and now everything we know about climate change. So that, I think, is just the first step there. But I also think there's just another sort of other issue that you're raising, sort of, which is, the U.S. working class. I mean, the U.S. working class is and has consistently been revolting all the time. I mean, the problem is it hasn't had the right leadership. But I mean, just recently, they were burning down police stations in Minneapolis, Ferguson, Baltimore. We've seen like outright uprisings that have directly challenged the state and burned down significant millions of dollars of property damage in major cities in ways that for at least a night or two, the police could not control. Right. So that does speak to some elements of it. I would say the average worker in America in the early 1920s was probably doing better than the average working person in China in the early 1920s. But nonetheless, the early 1920s was a period of great labor combativity. People should just Google mine wars and look at the mine wars that were happening in 1919, 1920, 1921, Cabin Creek, look that up. Harlan County, Kentucky, which is a little later in history, you look that up. That's an important factor. 1946 was, a year of great strikes. And in fact, one where the government was, and the ruling class was very fearful of the power of workers of the United States to actually move towards socialism. I mean, this was actually some of what they were discussing. And when they were discussing the reality of the post-war world, was the fact that in America and Europe, they might have trouble controlling workers wanting to have, a non-capitalist society after this, terrible slaughter. No surprise that big waves of revolutions tend to happen after world wars, happened after World War I and World War II. And I think a lot of it is because the carnage is so great, and it's so directed by the elites that it gives people a new sense of the type of world we need. So I just say all that to say, there's no real lack of combativity of the working class in U.S. history. There's a huge amount of discontent in the U.S. on a relative sense, even though the living standards are all relative, really. So like the average American worker, and this is a big part of American propaganda, like, well, it's bad here, but like at least you're not living in, wherever, Nigeria or whatever people's perception of where people are living bad is. Although, look, there's a lot of people living real well in Nigeria.
Yeah,
too, so
there are. Yeah, there are.
But, the suppression of wages in America, the fact that wages have been totally decoupled from productivity, that the minimum wage has continued to lag, like even if American workers are doing better in a relative sense than, say, people in Bangladesh, they are still actually making very little money in relationship to what they actually create. And the web of debt that we've all been caught in is heavily predicated on the fact that the US ruling class is, yes, using the proceeds of imperialism to give people a slightly higher living standard, but they're actually using it mainly to enrich themselves and suppressing the living standard of people and giving credit-based inducements in order to create a broad consumer culture that, isn't all that it looks like, right? Like everyone knows about rent-to-own furniture. It might look nice in your apartment, but you really can't afford all that stuff, right? You know what I mean? Yeah, and the way that it's being parceled out to you is a reflection of the fact that you are still deeply exploited from a labor perspective. And that's the thing about globalized labor and the globalized economy. Like that's what it is. It's like a handful of ultra elite people who are keeping everyone else down in a relative sense. And they're keeping some people like way, way down and some people like less way down. But the whole goal is to keep everybody down and under them and subordinate to them. So the vast majority of the opportunities and privileges that are created by our society only flow to that tiny group of people. And so I think we have to see the global proletariat and the global working class and oppressed people as one entity, because that's how they see it. Like capital goes across borders freely. It's only workers who are like, oh, you from Hungary, so I can't mess with that. Oh, you came from Haiti, so like you against me. Oh, these people in China, they're not thinking like that. They're thinking, let's get the rich people in Hungary, the rich people in Haiti, the rich people who hate China, who are tired of the Communist Party. Like, let's get all those people together and like try to create an entity that can go and hold everybody else down around the world. And I think our mentality has to be similar.
And I also just want to add the fact that, we live in a very interconnected world. Like you can't separate the West from the rest of the world, or the global North from the rest of the world, or the imperial core countries from the rest of the world, because what happens in one part affects the other. So you can have this idea of compartmentalizing and yeah, who cares what happens over there, but it's actually going to impact everywhere. And I'm also kind of reminded, during the genocide in Gaza, which is still ongoing, and we're going to kind of talk about later on in this episode how that fits into all of this. I'm reminded of when the late Hassan Nasrallah was giving one of his first speeches, after October 7th, and he gave a nod to protesters across the West. So, I mean, I know there's people who have this attitude of who cares what people in the West do, it doesn't matter. But, actually it matters what everyone does everywhere. It's actually really, really important. And leaders of global South resistance struggles recognize that. And they have said as much. There's that story that Vijay Prashad always tells about Ho Chi Minh telling this Italian comrade to, when he was like, what can we do, to help the struggle in Vietnam? And he's like, go do revolution in your country. Because again, another global South leader who's under the boot of imperialism, recognizing the importance of revolutionary struggle in the imperial core countries. That matters. And to not care, or to think it's going to be fine if it just implodes in a fascist mess, that's going to take the world down with it. Anyways, all that's to say, I think I think that's also a good segue, Eugene, into the past moments of fascism and more recent history. I think it's not just important to look at the rise of fascism, but also what was the resistance to that fascism? What did it look like? And what can we learn from it, right? When we look, because there was some successes and there was a lot of failures. So when we look at, for example, the failures of the German and Italian left before fascism took power, I think it's important to maybe briefly go over what stands out there, and what can we today kind of learn from those failures. Obviously, everything isn't the same. Italian fascism wasn't exactly the same as German fascism, and how it came about isn't exactly the same as American fascism, and is not exactly the same as the context we're in today. Nonetheless, there are lessons to be learned.
Yeah, there are many lessons to be learned. Maybe that's an episode for itself. So, since I've been so long-winded here, let me try to think about what the actual key lessons are. I mean, from my point of view, I think the key element that we can draw from that history is the inability of sort of the quote unquote progressive forces writ large to be able to create a sustainable new politics. I mean, so much, and this goes back to kind of the very first thing I said about how fascism is sort of weaponized in the US context, especially by liberals and Democrats. There's a whole history that is put forward that is basically fake about what took place in Germany that boils down to this: that if you don't vote for the Democrats, you're going to bring in Hitler, who is Trump or whoever it is that year. It's always Hitler from the point of view of these liberals. But, I think Trump at least has a little bit more resonance to it. And that was the problem with the communists in Germany, is that the communists didn't go with whoever. They never really actually describe who any of the other political parties are. I feel like when people say this, but the implication that the Social Democrats, the SPD, is the same thing as the Democrats in America, and that because the communists wouldn't unite with the Social Democrats, that's why Hitler came in. So it's all about the communists being evil people. And there's a number of sort of logical fallacies, sort of nested within that. The first and foremost is that the Social Democrats didn't want to work with the communists either. So that, there's if we want to be saying who was not working with whom, I think that there's plenty to parcel out there. But, that to be said, how do we even get to Trump? Lesser of two evil politics. I mean, they've been saying since at least 1984, everyone who's progressive vote for the Democrats to prevent, fascism. I mean, they used to say Reagan was a fascist too. And, not for bad reason either with some of the things he was doing, even though that's not been wiped out, but, or memory hold, you could say. But that being said, it's the contradictions that were created by this bipartisan agenda that was, basically Republican and Republican light with the lesser of two evils through the 80s, throughout the 90s, into the 2000s that created, the contradictions in the global economy that made mass immigration possible. That's U.S. trade policy, who actually pushed forward. It was Bill Clinton was the first one to put the issue of tough on the border, which was part of the continuation of the Reagan era tough on crime, law and order mentality, which the Democrats took over lock, stock, and barrel. The elimination of social rights and provisions, like, eliminating public housing. And then you wonder why you have a homelessness crisis in the context where you eliminated public housing and you drastically slashed the ability of people to get social assistance from the government, so-called welfare. Why do you have a homelessness crisis and a massive affordable housing crisis? Like, all the things from immigration to the neocon wars to the movement of the growth of poverty and all these other things that have created all these contradictions. Like, why are the cities all messed up in America? Why are people coming from all these other countries? Why are we wrapped up in all these wars? Is the bipartisan nature of lesser of two evil politics. And by the Democrats speaking to many of the problems that people have, but not proposing solutions that meet the scale of the problem, it creates political space that more fascistic and far-right forces are able to exploit at people's anger at the persistence of these issues that neither political party seems to be able to solve. And it also cheapens the opposition to far-right policies, because people say, well, we've heard this all before from the Democrats and they didn't do anything. So it actually helps grow it. And that, in a way, is an important thing in Germany, because that is what happened, is that the SPD, the Social Democrats, neither the Social Democrats or the communists wanted the Nazis to come to power. And they both were pursuing political strategies designed to prevent that. The Social Democrats, though, chained themselves to these centrist parties. And similar to the Democrats in America, they did many things that exacerbated the problems that existed. They were speaking to a lot of problems, but not promoting solutions that met the scale of those problems. And it was in the context of that, decay of the system that Hitler was able to deeply exploit both that reality and the disunity amongst the popular forces in order to surge to the forefront. But I guess I don't want to go on a long thing here, so let me just say this about that. The question is always posed by liberals in America: why didn't the communists unite with the Social Democrats? I.e., why don't people who hate the Democrats in America unite with the Democrats? Well, here's another way to look at that. Hitler hated communists more than anyone else. No doubt about that. You look at Mein Kampf, he talks about it. He has a whole chapter in there about the difference between him and the communists. The only reason they call themselves the National Socialists is because socialism, in some way, shape, or form, was so popular and so deeply rooted in the popular classes of Germany going back to the 1860s that you couldn't really be a movement that was rooted in the masses of people against the elites, which is how the Nazis were presenting themselves, without some sort of allusion to that history. But Hitler was very clear that the Soviet Union was the main enemy, that the communists and the Marxists were the main enemy of the Nazi movement, and that the main reason why all other political forces, the church, the big businesses, and others should support them is that they were going to make sure that the communists didn't take power in Germany, which was very possible. So the antithesis of Nazism was communism. So shouldn't the question kind of be posed the other way around? Why did the Social Democrats and all the other anti-Nazi forces support the communists and actually support a communist government inside of Germany? Because the thing that the Nazis feared the most, that they felt was the most antithetical to their agenda, was the communist agenda. So if you hate the Nazis and want to be antithetical to the Nazis, you should be supporting communism. So maybe the liberals in America should learn a similar lesson. And I say this to people sincerely, and the liberal people, the progressive people who are good people, who want to see many of the same things as those of us who are socialists and communists. Maybe there's a lot of things we don't agree on, but the only way you're going to get any of what you want is to support the same people. Because why, again, is Trump ranting and raving about the Marxists and the cultural Marxist and the communist, and we're going to root them out? Because it's the most antithetical thing to the ultra-right agenda. And the thing that they fear the most, these super wealthy right-wing reactionaries that are backing him, is that working class people will take power and disempower capitalists. Like, that's communism. Like, working class people saying we're going to make everything run for our benefit. And if it doesn't work out for capitalists, too bad, too sad. And at the end of the day, they don't want to be too bad or too sad. They don't want to give up their power and their privilege. They want to prevent that at all cost. So why not unify around a new political vision? This was the essence of what I'm saying here in Germany and in Italy that wasn't able to take place, was the socialist, the communist, to be able to create a new politics that broke from the mainstream agenda, that actually solved people's problems and moved society forward. Like that was what wasn't able to come together in that time, and that what could have potentially defeated Nazism and created a new future. So if we want to defeat the sort of semi-fascistic and actual fascistic elements that are increasingly dominating the politics of America, people who are progressive have to recognize that the way to do that is to learn from them and to support the things that they view are the most antithetical to their cause. And that's much more radical left-wing socialist communist leadership than most sort of liberal progressive organizations are willing to accept. And that's why they can't do anything to stop Trump.
No, that's really important. And I think that's another good segue into, the fact that we're seeing tens of thousands of people show up across the country to these AOC and Bernie Sanders rallies, mostly Bernie Sanders rallies. And, that energy is real. I don't want to discount that. And it's really important, especially in this moment. But then we run into several problems, right? Because what's the direction of that energy? It's not a call to action. There's some, calls to actions, but not the kind of call to action, you or I maybe think should be called for. It's kind of like, getting everybody to the runway, but the plane just like never takes off. That's what it feels like when it comes to these sorts of figures like the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders. But they are obviously tapping into a mass energy and mass grievance that is important to organize, to convert into real organizing power. So I guess, how do we build a united front that doesn't collapse into liberalism, but, also, isolate itself through sectarian purity, which is another issue in and of itself. But how do we build that united front that doesn't go down the road of liberalism, that doesn't get, folded back into the Democratic Party, which has happened in the past? And I guess, what does it mean about the sort of contradictory roles that somebody like Bernie Sanders plays?
No, it's a good point. And I think it starts with clarity on the question that you just raised. It starts with the fact that we must break from the Democrats. Like, and I'm talking about the possibility of creating a new politics that can transcend the existing politics and move us further. I can use a more American example. That's the abolitionist movement, right? Like the abolitionist movement moved from the margin to the center. And ultimately in 1860, the anti-slavery movement, which the core of which is the abolitionists, the most successful third party in history, the Republicans, Abraham Lincoln, they actually took power. So I think we should actually learn from them. Like, let's not just talk about them, because everyone talks about them. It's all great. We all want to talk about them, but no one wants to actually read the history. Okay, that's false. Many people want to read the history, but there are people who are deliberately misinterpreting the history, and people who are just dumb and in the service of misinterpreting it and don't actually know it. But that being said, the abolitionists were not like, yeah, let's try to reform the two major parties. They were like, let's destroy them because they're both pro-slavery and create a new anti-slavery entity that can take over, right? And the way they moved anti-slavery politics to the margin, it was the Liberty Party, it was the Free Soil Party, it was later the Republican Party. It was this chipping away over a number of years of the consensus of the existing ruling class elites and creating a new political instrument that could directly challenge them, right? Like they did not... So the anti-slavery people, abolitionists were like, let's not reform the Whigs, which is basically the Democrats now. That was like the sort of semi-anti-slavery party, but some of them were for slavery, right? Like half were for slavery, half weren't. So they were not thinking, yeah, let's reform these people. They were like, it's unreformable because slavery is the key contradiction. We have to create a new political force. So I think we have to recognize that we're not going to move forward. I mean, I already gave the whole discourse about how lesser of two evils got us to Trump. So I'm not going to recapitulate that. But the question is how do you really move forward? And I think realistically, we have to look again to this example. Similar to slavery, the issue is capitalism. And people don't want to name it sometimes, although I think it's getting more into the discourse. But this is something we have to continue to pound away at. Like there is no real progressive politics that's not anti-capitalist and socialist. Because the problems that exist in society that progressive people are concerned about are rooted in the system of capitalism. And it is the fact that the ruling class would prefer to build up a giant army of repression than give like the slightest concession to people on like child tax credits that, lets you know that they're not going to move in a substantially more progressive direction. The fact Biden couldn't even pass Build Back Better, that should just tell you something right there, right? Like, I mean, because Build Back Better was like not that bad. But all it really was putting a lot of money in programs that already existed. So it wasn't like a big change and revolution. So if you can't even get like a big surge of funding to programs that already have bipartisan support and mass and huge majority support in America, under the Democrats, controlling the presidency in both houses, coming into power after an unprecedented uprising of people against racism after George Floyd, and extreme anger over how COVID was handled. Like, if in that moment you can't even do the most basic thing, what really leads you to believe that somehow the country, through like existing political parties and institutions, is going to significantly move in a quote unquote more progressive direction, which really just means, average everyday people being able to live a dignified life? It's just not possible. So the only way to actually address this is to recognize that capitalism is the root, that we have to have socialism, that, as Marx said, the workers can't just take hold of the ready-made state machinery. You need new institutions to establish a new way of living. To have people first instead of profit first can't exist in a 1787 constitutional framework. We need new shared agreements of how we live and work amongst each other.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews.